Things I've learned since working in professional baseball, part 2. The game will always be the best teacher. So for those of you that don't know, I run a company called Fold and Fast Pitch, and we do camps, clinics, and a ton of lessons. And we have an online presence with elitefastpitch.tv, and where we train athletes, baseball and softball across the country and internationally as well. And I did that solely for about 10 years before I got hired into professional baseball. And most of what I did was working one-on-one with players, or maybe in some small group classes, or doing camps and clinics. But it was always me, surrounded by players, and they weren't playing games. They weren't surrounded by their other coaches. It was just me talking to the players. And so when you do that for a long period of time, you lose sight of how important games are for development. You think that if the kid comes in and has a really good cage session that they got better. Well, maybe that might be the case. I hope it's the case. But there's still a test, which is the game that the player has to go out and perform in. And that's where it really matters. And so now that I'm working in professional baseball, we have to get guys a ton of at-bats before we really know what our training regimen for that player should be. And that's completely backwards to how it is in the facility world, which I'm training 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds who haven't had a ton of life at-bats to tell me any information. And I'm probably not going out to those games to watch those kids take those at-bats, and I'm not getting feedback on the games. And that's what games give us. They give us feedback to tell us how to train the players, right? So we have to let these players play before we know how to train them. And I think if I could go back and tell my younger self something, it would be to go out and watch these kids play more, which obviously takes up time, and it takes you away from your family and your hobbies and whatever else that you like to do when you're not in the cage. But it is a very, very important piece of the development puzzle, because the game will tell you what that player needs. If that player is consistently late on fastballs, the only way that we'll know that is by watching them play games. The game will teach us that, right? A cage environment can be manipulated. A cage environment could be the result of a bad day. And when you see a player once a week for a half hour, that's not enough time to evaluate the player. I don't care what anybody says. And my younger self would probably argue with me right now, but my younger self would be dead wrong, because we don't know how to evaluate players in a once a week setting. We should evaluate players over time, and sometimes it's a long period of time. It's not just a week or 2 weeks or a month. And I know as parents and as coaches, we get frustrated sometimes with our players not getting better like that. Let me tell you how professional baseball works, right? We tend to give players hundreds of at-bats before we even try to tinker or change something about their swing. Hundreds. That means years in some cases before we have decided that that player needs to make a change, right? And why do we do that? Because we understand that the game is going to tell us what we need. We want them to be successful in games. We don't need them to be good practice players, right? We're not here to just build their confidence in the cage. It's part of it, don't get me wrong, but that's not what we're here for. We're here because we want them to be successful in games and ultimately get to the big league level, right? Which means they need enough at-bats to tell us what we need to work on. So as a coach, your ego needs to get out of the door and understand that if that player is not performing in games and the game is telling us what we need, we have to be willing to listen. We can't be bigger than the game. We can't be more knowledgeable than the game that's been around for centuries, right? We have to be willing to listen. If that player's not performing, we have to be willing to say, hey, I need to change something about my training regimen for the betterment of the player.